They have been called America's fifth coast, and their combined 5,000 miles of continuous coastline are longer than either the Atlantic or the Pacific coasts. They are the 5 Great Lakes of North America: Lake Superior, Huron, Michigan, Erie, and Ontario. Located in the upper central part of North America, the Great Lakes hold 1/5 of all the fresh water found on the planet Earth. They were formed a mere 5,000 years ago, as the vast continental glacier of the last ice age finished melting. So geologically speaking, the Great Lakes are very young. The massive sheet of ice that helped claw out the lake beds with its relentless grinding movement was over 1.25 miles thick. Over the centuries, the Great Lakes have supported native cultures, fur trappers, lumberjacks, miners, fishermen, and of course, sailors. The Great Lakes played one of the key roles in the exploration and settlement of the North American continent. And to this day, they continue to be at the center of the lives of the more than 50 million people who live within 100 miles of their shores. At the end of the 19th century, when the use of electricity turned from a novelty into an everyday fact of life, the Great Lakes played a major role in its development. Long before the discovery of electricity, man had figured out how to use water to turn a wheel and do work like run a sawmill or grind grain into flour. Using water in this way is called hydropower. Hydro is Greek for water. Early mills and factories got their power from setting up a water wheel on a river or stream. Of course, the more volume or water pressure a river has, the more power it can generate. When water is used to generate electricity, this is known as hydroelectric power. And around the Great Lakes, nothing can match Niagara Falls' ability to generate power. Located on the Niagara River between the east end of Lake Erie and the west end of Lake Ontario, the falls have been a wonder to everyone who has seen them. Because the falls have the largest drop in elevation along the length of the inland waterway, they offer the greatest potential for producing power. It's just one of the many reasons Niagara Falls played such an important role in the development of the entire region surrounding the Great Lakes. The first example of hydropower came as early as 1757, when water from the river was directed to a sawmill. By 1845, a number of other types of mills had joined it. In the beginning, hydropower was simply a water wheel driving belts and gears that turned machines. All of that changed in 1879, when Thomas Edison invented the modern light bulb. Soon after, Edison invented the modern power station, and by 1882, water was turning turbine generators that would eventually supply electricity to factories all around the Great Lakes. In 1905, the first power station was built by the Ontarí'io Power Company on the Canadian side of the Niagara River. And in less than 15 years, there were another 10 power-generating stations working along the Niagara River. By 1958, the old stations were replaced by 3 new, larger power plants that could generate over 15 billion units of energy a year. That's more than enough power to light New York City, Cleveland, Detroit, Buffalo, Rochester, Toronto, and all of the smaller towns in between. In fact, so much water was being diverted to the turbines that the United States and Canada signed a treaty to allow enough water to pass over the Niagara Falls to maintain its natural beauty. In addition to the hydro plants at Niagara, the Great Lakes also support a number of nuclear and coal-fired power plants that together deliver electricity to over 50 million people in the United States and Canada. A large water supply is very important in the operation of coal and nuclear power plants. Both coal and nuclear plants work by heating water and making steam that drives the turbine generators. In addition, nuclear power plants also require massive amounts of water to cool the fuel rods used in creating nuclear-based energy, making the Great Lakes an attractive location for the plants. The need for more electrical power increased with the growing populations of the United States and Canada. 3 large networks of high power lines, known as grids, were built to carry electricity to where the people needed it. The Eastern Grid is by far the largest of them all, and at its heart are the power plants of the Great Lakes. In the summer of 2003, a failure at a Lake Erie power plant in Cleveland created a domino effect. When there wasn't enough electricity to operate the safety systems of the nuclear power plants, they began falling offline, compounding the crisis around the lakes. Then the entire Northeast, from Detroit and Toronto to New York and Boston, virtually lost all power in the largest blackout, not only in the history of the United States and Canada, but in the history of the world. Over 50 million people were affected, and the power drain resulted in financial losses of over $5 billion. It took over 14 hours for the problems to be solved and power restored to the 9 states and 2 Canadian provinces that were affected. Studies are now being conducted in both countries to see what can be done to prevent another such blackout. Lake Ontario takes its name from the Iroquois language. It translates as shining waters. With a length of just 193 miles and at 53 miles wide, Lake Ontario is the smallest of the 5 Great Lakes in surface area. However, with a maximum depth of 802 feet, Lake Ontario is the 3rd deepest and is the 4th among the lakes in the volume of water that it holds. It's the 10th largest freshwater lake in the entire world. Lake Ontario is bounded on the south by the state of New York, and on the north side and at its west end by the Canadian province of Ontario. Water enters Lake Ontario primarily through the Niagara River, which connects it to Lake Erie on the west. From 568 feet above sea level at Lake Erie, the waters of the Great Lakes make a drop of 326 feet in elevation as they course through the Niagara River and flow into Lake Ontario. 178 feet of the drop take place at once as the water rushes over Niagara Falls. At its east end, the waters exit Lake Ontario through the St. Lawrence River and flow on to the St. Lawrence Seaway. From that point, it's 1,200 miles to reach the Atlantic Ocean. The south shore of Lake Ontario, from the Finger Lakes east to Lake Champlain in New York State, was home to the 5 tribes who make up the Iroquois Confederation. They called themselves the Haudenosaunee, which means people of the Longhouse. The 5 tribes were the Mohawks, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, and the Seneca. They were not always allies. For centuries, they made war on each other. Then, an Iroquois by the name of Hiawatha proposed that the 5 tribes unite against their common enemies and live by a set of laws. Beginning as early as 1570 and lasting for over 200 years, the Iroquois Confederacy was the strongest Indian alliance to be found in all of North America. The Iroquois Confederation would eventually win victory over their arch-enemies, the Hurons, and other Algonquin-speaking tribes that lived to the north across Lake Ontario in what would eventually become Canada. The Iroquois League lasted up until the late 18th century, when the tribes, decimated by European diseases, fell from power. The Iroquois were primarily farmers. They lived in fortified stockades that surrounded their longhouses, where from 3 to 5 families would live together. The Iroquois are noted for the making of elaborate wooden masks. The masks played an important role in their medicine ceremonies. Lake Ontario is the first Great Lake in line when arriving from the St. Lawrence River. the route traveled by the French when they originally came to North America. However, the Iroquois controlled the upper St. Lawrence River, and because they were enemies to the French, forced them to go around Lake Ontario. This resulted in the French discovering Lake Huron first, in 1614. Less than 4 months later, Samuel de Champlain reached the western end of Lake Ontario while scouting the Iroquois with a party of Huron guides. Although Champlain and the Hurons defeated the Iroquois in the first 3 battles they fought, the Iroquois and their English allies eventually won the struggle for power around the Great Lakes. Following the War of 1812, once the borders between Canada and the United States were officially established, the United States began to develop the lands along the shores of the Great Lakes. Key to this new development was a man-made canal known as the Erie Canal. Built in 1824, it connected the Hudson River and New York Harbor directly to Lake Erie, 325 miles to the west. The reason the canal bypassed Lake Ontario and connected directly to Lake Erie was to avoid the large drop at Niagara Falls. The closest the Erie Canal came to Lake Ontario was 5 miles at the town of Rochester, New York. Rochester grew from a small settlement in 1812 to become a full-fledged town not more than 10 years after the opening of the Erie Canal. The impact of the Erie Canal was not lost on the Canadians. Until it was built, all commerce from the Great Lakes had to travel down the St. Lawrence River, be portaged around Niagara Falls, and pass through Montreal, Quebec. Faced with the potential loss of commerce, a Canadian named William H. Merritt proposed that another canal be built, one that would permit ships to pass from Lake Erie directly into Lake Ontario, and from there continue down the St. Lawrence River to the Atlantic Ocean. In 1829, the Welland Canal, spanning the 26-mile-wide Isthmus of Niagara, was opened for business. An isthmus is a narrow strip of land that separates 2 bodies of water. The original canal used a total of 39 wooden locks, and the longest ships that could pass through them were limited to 110 feet. 12 years after its opening, a newer, better Welland Canal was built alongside the first. It now took only 27 locks to travel between the lakes. Over the years, the canal would be rebuilt and enlarged another 4 times. The Welland Canal of today was completed in 1931. Not only were the new locks capable of handling ships up to 800 feet long, the canal, which had started off at a depth of just 8 feet, was now 26 feet deep and 300 feet wide. 7 giant locks lift and lower ships as they cross the Niagara Isthmus. The Erie and Welland Canals were the engineering marvels of their day, both made necessary by that stunning natural wonder of the world, Niagara Falls. Without a doubt, the most spectacular sight in all of the Great Lakes region is Niagara Falls, located on the Niagara River that connects Lake Ontario to Lake Erie. The 36-mile-long Niagara River is also the international boundary between the United States and Canada. The twin cities of Niagara Falls are connected by the Rainbow Bridge. Niagara is actually 3 separate falls. Horseshoe Falls, on the Canadian side, takes its name from its deep curve. Here, the falls are over 2,000 feet wide and plunge a total of 177 feet. In the middle, separating the 3 falls, is Goat Island. The smallest of the falls, Bridal Veil Falls, is separated from the American Falls by tiny Luna Island. At 184 feet, the American Falls are higher by 7 feet, but less than half as wide as the Canadian Falls. The most exciting way of all to see them and feel their power is aboard the Maid of the Mist. Sailing from both sides of the river, the Maids of the Mist motor right up to the base of Horseshoe Falls and nearly pass underneath. If you make the trip, plan to get wet. Only one person has ever gone over Horseshoe Falls and lived, that is, without any protective gear. The man was rescued and then arrested. No person has ever survived going over the far more dangerous American Falls. Over the years, all of the Great Lakes have experienced problems with pollution because of industry and population growth. Around the turn of the 20th century, the Canadian town of Hamilton, at the western end of Lake Ontario, was home to the two largest steel-producing companies in Canada. At one point, these plants were some of the largest polluters on the entire lake. And unfortunately for Lake Ontario, because it's the last in the line of drainage of the 5 Great Lakes, it receives pollutants from the other 4 lakes as well. The chemicals used in the manufacturing of plastic products created one of the worst pollution problems on the Great Lakes. It happened at a place called Love Canal, centrally located not far from Buffalo, New York, Niagara Falls, and Lake Ontario itself. Manufacturing plants in the region had been dumping their waste at the Love Canal. There, more than 100,000 tons of toxic waste were leaking into the Lake Ontario water system. This serious pollution problem resulted in international efforts between the United States and Canada to improve the condition of all the lakes. The city of Toronto, located on the North Shore near the west end of Lake Ontario, is the capital of the Canadian province of Ontario. With a population of over 1 million people, Toronto is the largest city on the lake. It was first known as Fort York when built by the English in 1793. After the War of 1812 ended, a town grew up around the fort. It was later incorporated as the City of Toronto. From its position on Lake Ontario, Toronto became a center of transportation, both in shipping on the lake and in railroads over land. Manufacturing grew because raw materials were located close by, and the waterway offered a means to export Toronto's products to the entire world. Since World War II, an influx of over 400,000 immigrants has made Toronto one of the most internationally flavored cities in the world. Located at the western end of Lake Ontario, the city of Hamilton got its start in 1778 when American colonists loyal to the British Crown moved there to escape the Revolutionary War. Hamilton of today has a growing population headed towards 500,000 people. 2 of the largest steel companies in Canada are still found here. Once major polluters of Lake Ontario, the steel companies of today have become responsible corporate citizens and strive to minimize their impact on the lake. Hamilton's harbor is the 3rd largest of any of the Great Lakes in terms of tonnage handled every year. Rochester, New York sits virtually at the middle of Lake Ontario's south shore. With a population near 200,000, it's the largest American city on Lake Ontario. Both Xerox, makers of the copying machine, and Eastman Kodak, makers of the first easy-to-use camera, began here. The citizens of Rochester still enjoy a walk down the banks of the Erie Canal, which runs to the south of town. Though it's approaching 200 years old, the Erie Canal is still in use, carrying freight even today. It is first and it is last, depending on which direction you're headed. If you're on your way up the inland waterway, Lake Ontario will be the first lake you encounter as you leave the St. Lawrence River. But if you're on your way down the waterway, Lake Ontario is the last lake you'll pass through on your way to the sea. In either direction, it's unavoidably attached to the chain of Great Lakes that have for centuries remained at the center of the lives of people in Canada and the United States. And who can forget one of the most important sights on all of the Great Lakes, Niagara Falls, an obstacle so great it caused 2 grand canals to be built, one on either side. A dynamo of power so strong it can light Toronto and New York City, all the while being so stunningly beautiful that it continues to inspire nearly all who see it. And the vitality of the lake continues to grow. New forms of transportation are still being developed along the lake. A brand new ferry between Rochester and Toronto will begin service for passengers, cars, and cargo. The 2 countries that occupy the opposing shores of the Great Lakes are perhaps the friendliest 2 nations in the world. For they realize that only through mutual cooperation can the United States of America and the Dominion of Canada continue to enjoy the commerce, transportation, and recreation that these 5 Great Lakes have to offer.